Claire smirked as she fastened the delicate clasp of her diamond earrings, admiring her reflection in the bedroom mirror. The deep burgundy dress hugged her curves in all the right places, and her heels gave her just enough height to make her presence commanding without seeming excessive. She had perfected the art of effortless elegance, just alluring enough to turn heads, but not so overdone that it raised questions. She turned toward Mark, who sat on the bed, his laptop open but his eyes focused solely on her. His gaze was unreadable, calm as ever. That was the thing about Mark. He never gave too much away. Some men would question the sudden effort she put into her appearance for a simple work dinner. Some would ask where the dinner was, who would be there, or what time she expected to return. But not Mark. He merely watched, silent and composed, and Claire took his lack of reaction as permission. "It's just dinner with coworkers, babe," she said, her voice light, as if this were any other evening. "I won't be late." She saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Brief, barely perceptible. Doubt? Amusement? No, that was impossible. Mark nodded. Of course. And that was that. No interrogation, no hesitation. Claire grabbed her clutch and walked out the door, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. Mark's suspicion. The house was quiet when she left, the only sound coming from the hum of the ceiling fan above him. Mark sat still, his fingers resting lightly on the laptop's keyboard, but his mind was elsewhere. There was something too polished about her tonight, too intentional. Claire had always been beautiful, but tonight she had taken extra care, not just in her appearance, but in her words, in her demeanor, the way she had preemptively answered a question he hadn't even asked. That was the first red flag. The second came minutes later, when Claire's phone, forgotten on the kitchen counter, vibrated with a soft chime. Mark glanced at it, intending to ignore it, until the preview of the message caught his eye. It was a location tag. Le Vigne, 8:12 p.m. Mark's brow furrowed slightly. He knew Levine well, an intimate, upscale restaurant, far from the casual places Claire's co-workers usually preferred. A place for anniversaries, for proposals, a place where couples sat too close, hands reaching across candlelit tables, not a place for work dinners. His pulse remained steady, but his decision was already made. He grabbed his keys. It was time to see the truth for himself. The drive to Le Vigne was silent. Mark barely registered the passing streetlights or the faint hum of the engine beneath him. His grip on the steering wheel was relaxed, his breathing even, but his mind was sharp, processing everything with cold precision. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, to let emotions dictate his actions. He believed in evidence, in facts, in truth that couldn't be twisted or explained away. Tonight, he would find that truth. Claire's choice of restaurant had been deliberate. He was sure of it. Le Vigne wasn't a place where groups of co-workers casually met for drinks after a long day. It was intimate, secluded, filled with quiet corners where whispered conversations lingered over half-finished glasses of wine. It was the kind of place people went to when they didn't want to be seen. He pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine. From where he sat, he could see through the large front windows of the restaurant. The warm glow of chandeliers cast a golden hue over the patrons, the flickering candlelight on each table adding to the illusion of romance. Mark stepped out of the car, adjusting his sleeves, his movements slow and measured. He wasn't here to cause a scene. He wasn't here to yell or demand answers. That wasn't his style. He preferred something much more effective. A silence that did all the talking for him. As he walked toward the entrance, his eyes scanned the restaurant, searching, and then he saw her. Claire sat near the window, her back partially turned toward him, but there was no mistaking the elegant curve of her neck, the way she leaned forward slightly, engaged, intimate. Her hand rested lightly on the table. Not idly, not thoughtlessly. It was placed directly over another hand. Mark's gaze lifted to the man sitting across from her. David. The name clicked into place the moment he saw him. Mark had met him once before, in passing. He was well-dressed, well-groomed, the type of man who was used to getting what he wanted. And tonight, what he wanted was sitting right in front of him, laughing softly at something he had just said. Mark didn't rush. He didn't storm inside. Instead, he walked with purpose, his presence alone an unseen force moving toward them. It was only when he was a few steps away that Claire's laughter abruptly stopped, as if she had sensed him before even seeing him. Then she looked up, and everything changed. The moment she knew, Claire's face drained of color so quickly that for a moment Mark thought she might faint. Her wide eyes locked onto his, frozen in an expression that flickered between shock, panic, and something else. A silent plea. David, on the other hand, was slower to react. He sat upright, his grip on the wineglass tightening slightly, his confidence, that easy arrogance he carried, fractured. Mark didn't need to say anything. The moment had already done the damage for him. Claire's fingers, which had been resting so comfortably on David's hand, recoiled as if she had touched something scalding. The motion was automatic, instinctive. Too late. A fork slipped from her fingers and clattered against her plate. It was a small sound, barely noticeable over the murmur of the restaurant, but to Claire, it might as well have been a gunshot. Mark tilted his head slightly, watching her. He saw everything in those few seconds. The fear, the calculations running through her mind as she scrambled to formulate an excuse. But there were no more excuses. The game was over. Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. Mark let the silence stretch. He wanted her to feel it, to drown in it, to understand. David shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the table in an attempt to mask his unease. He wasn't smiling anymore. Claire swallowed, her voice finally breaking through the tension. Mark, He raised a hand, a simple, effortless movement that cut through her words like a blade. Claire stopped instantly. Mark let his gaze flicker toward David, giving him just a second of acknowledgement before returning his full attention to Claire. He wanted her to understand that this wasn't about him. This wasn't about the man she had chosen. This was about her. She had built this illusion, crafted her perfect lie so meticulously, so flawlessly, thinking she had control of the narrative. And yet, in a matter of seconds, it had all fallen apart. Mark exhaled slowly, as if he had considered her words, as if he had even entertained the idea of letting her explain. Then, with a voice so even it was terrifying, he finally spoke. So, how's the work dinner going? And with that, the final piece of Claire's facade shattered. The moment stretched endlessly, thick with a tension that pressed down on the table, suffocating the air between them. Claire's lips parted slightly, her breath shallow, her mind racing for an explanation that could undo what had already been seen. But there was no escape. No carefully crafted words could erase the way she had instinctively pulled her hand away from David's, the way the color had drained from her face the instant she locked eyes with her husband. Across from her, David shifted in his chair, his fingers twitching around the base of his wine glass. The confidence he had so easily exuded only minutes ago, smirking, leaning in close, whispering things that made Claire laugh, had vanished. He had underestimated Mark. He had assumed, like Claire, that Mark would never be the type to notice, the type to act. And yet here he was, standing at their table, perfectly composed, watching. Claire's voice, when it finally emerged, was fragile. Mark, Mark tilted his head and she stopped immediately, her breath catching. He hadn't said a word, hadn't raised his voice. Yet she knew better than to continue. He turned slightly, placing his phone on the table in front of her, screen facing up. The text thread was open, the location tag, the lie in black and white. For Claire, it was devastating. For Mark, it was simply confirmation. She stared at the message, her mouth tightening as her brain fought for something, anything, to explain it away. But what could she say? That it was a mistake? That it was a misunderstanding? That somehow, against all logic, she wasn't really here with David right now? Mark didn't need to hear an excuse. He wasn't here for explanations. The evidence spoke for itself. David, desperate to salvage some dignity, cleared his throat. Listen, man. Mark's eyes flicked to him, and David shut up instantly. It wasn't an aggressive look, not threatening, not furious, just absolute, unwavering dismissal. David had been reduced to a bystander in his own affair, and he knew it. Mark's gaze returned to Claire. Talk to me, Mark, she whispered, her fingers trembling as she reached for him. Mark stepped back just enough that her hand hovered awkwardly in midair. The rejection, though small, was seismic. Claire's breathing quickened. Please, just let me explain. He studied her, his silence dragging the moment to unbearable lengths. Then, in a voice as calm as it was final, he said, Explain what? Claire's jaw tightened, her panic shifting into a desperate attempt at control. I didn't mean for this to... Mark exhaled, a quiet, humorless laugh escaping him. He glanced at David, then back at his wife, as if she wasn't even worth his anger. That was worse than if he had yelled, worse than if he had made a scene. Indifference was sharper than rage. Claire saw it in his face the moment he had stopped seeing her the way he once had. The realization knocked the breath from her lungs. David, still seated, still useless, finally found his voice. "Look, Mark, Mark cut him off without even looking at him. "Leave," David blinked. "What?" Mark's voice remained calm. "You heard me." David hesitated. His ego rebelled against the command, but the weight behind Mark's words made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. The man who had walked in here, quiet and unassuming, now controlled everything. David swallowed hard, glancing at Claire for support, but found none. Claire, still reeling, didn't meet his gaze. Her world was crumbling too quickly for her to focus on him. After a beat, David pushed his chair back and stood. He was taller than Mark, broader, but in this moment he looked small. He grabbed his jacket, exhaling through his nose as if trying to maintain some illusion of dignity, but they all knew he had already lost. Mark didn't watch him leave. He didn't have to. The sound of retreating footsteps, the way the nearby diners suddenly became intensely interested in their own plates. It was enough. Now it was just Claire, the aftermath. She was shaking, not with anger, not with indignation, with fear. Not fear of violence, Mark wasn't that kind of man. It was something worse, fear of the emptiness in his eyes. For years, Claire had always known where she stood with Mark, even when they fought, even when she tested him, even when she lied. She knew that somewhere beneath it all, he still loved her. Now, she wasn't sure anymore. She reached for him again, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, please." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, almost to himself. Then, as if coming to a decision, he turned on his heel and began walking away. Claire's stomach plummeted. She shot up from her chair, nearly knocking over her wineglass in her haste. "Mark, wait!" He didn't. She hurried after him, ignoring the looks from the surrounding tables. As she reached the restaurant's entrance, her hand barely brushed against his sleeve before he turned to face her. Eyes cold. Her throat tightened. "Let's talk. Please. I need to explain." Mark stared at her for a long moment, the weight of everything between them unspoken but absolute. Then, with a simple nod toward the door, he said, "Talk to him." Claire's stomach twisted violently. "No." He turned, stepping outside into the night, his footsteps measured and final. Claire felt the weight of 1,000 moments crash down upon her all at once. Every stolen glance, every quiet deception, every lie she had so confidently told herself. She had played the game too well. And now she had lost. Claire stood frozen at the restaurant entrance, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The cold night air wrapped around her, sharp and unforgiving, but it was nothing compared to the icy finality in Mark's voice before he walked away. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorframe to steady herself. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. In her mind, if this moment ever came, if Mark ever suspected, she had always assumed she could talk her way out of it. She was charming, persuasive, careful. She had rehearsed excuses before, ran through scenarios where she would feign innocence, manipulate the truth just enough to make him doubt his own instincts. But now, standing alone with nothing but the echo of Mark's footsteps fading into the night, she realized she had no control. She spun back toward the dining room, searching desperately for David, but he was already gone. He hadn't waited, hadn't even tried to salvage the night. The moment Mark told him to leave, he obeyed without question. Coward. Claire felt the sting of humiliation burn deep in her chest. David had been so confident, so smug when they were alone. He had whispered in her ear, "He'll never find out, Claire. You're too smart for that." But the moment he was caught, the moment Mark's quiet authority unraveled their lie, David folded. Now it was just her. The restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm, but Claire felt exposed. She could still sense the lingering stares from the surrounding tables. A few women glanced at her with quiet pity, while others smirked behind their wineglasses, as if silently reveling in her downfall. A waiter hesitated near her abandoned table, unsure whether to approach. She caught sight of her glass, her fingerprints smudged against the delicate stem, the wine untouched since Mark appeared. The reality sank in deeper. Everything had changed in an instant. The chase? Claire snapped out of it. She couldn't let this end like this. She had to fix it. With sudden urgency, she turned and ran out the door, ignoring the way her heels wobbled slightly against the pavement. Her breath came fast as she scanned the parking lot, searching. Then she saw him. Mark was already at his car, unlocking the door with smooth, deliberate movements. "Mark!" she called out, her voice sharp with panic. He didn't stop. She hurried forward, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Mark, please!" Finally, just as he was about to slide into the driver's seat, he paused. The only sound between them was the distant hum of passing traffic and the soft wind rustling through the trees. He didn't look at her immediately. His hands rested on the car door, his shoulders tense. Claire swallowed hard, stepping closer, searching his face for any trace of the man she knew. The man who had loved her unconditionally. He turned, meeting her gaze with calm, detached eyes. The look alone made her stomach drop. This wasn't the Mark she had always relied on. He wasn't furious. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even questioning her. He was simply done. Claire took another step, her voice softening. "Please, let's talk. Let's go home and just talk about this." Mark exhaled slowly, then shook his head, almost tiredly. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, voice steady, unreadable. Claire flinched, her fingers gripping the edge of his sleeve before she could stop herself. "Mark, you don't understand." He pulled his arm away effortlessly, not aggressively, just deliberately. "I understand perfectly," he replied. Claire felt her throat tighten. "It didn't mean anything," she tried, her voice cracking. Mark gave a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "It meant everything to me." The words hit her harder than a slap. He straightened, adjusting his jacket, his face giving away nothing. "Go back inside, Claire." Her breath hitched. "What?" Mark nodded toward the restaurant. "David might be gone, but you can still finish your wine. After all, it was supposed to be a work dinner." Claire's entire body flushed with shame. He had thrown her lie right back in her face, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her lips parted, but no words came. Mark studied her for a brief moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out his wedding ring. Claire's heart nearly stopped. He had taken it off. Slowly, deliberately, he placed it on the roof of the car. "I won't need this anymore," he said, simply. Panic surged through her. "No," she whispered. Mark's eyes met hers one last time. "Talk to him." Then before she could say another word, he got in the car, shut the door, and drove away. Claire stood there, staring at the empty space where his car had been. Her world had just fallen apart, and for the first time she realized there was no way to put it back together. Claire stood motionless in the dimly lit parking lot, her arms wrapped around herself as if that could hold together the pieces of her crumbling world. The cold air pricked at her skin, but she barely felt it. The real sting had come from Mark's final words. "Talk to him." The phrase echoed in her mind, each repetition cutting deeper. She turned slowly, staring at the empty space where his car had been. It was final. He was gone. Her fingers twitched at her sides, wanting to grab onto something, anything, that could stop the sinking feeling in her chest. The sense of control she had once held so firmly, the carefully constructed lies, the confident deceptions. All of it had unraveled in the span of minutes. Claire had always prided herself on being the one in charge. She set the rules. She decided what Mark knew and didn't know. But now Mark had taken control in the most devastating way possible, by simply walking away. She turned back toward the restaurant, the golden glow from inside now feeling foreign, almost mocking. A work dinner. That was the story she'd given him, and now she was just a woman standing alone in a parking lot, abandoned. A hollow victory. Claire pulled her phone from her clutch, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. David. She hesitated. Mark's voice played in her head. Talk to him. Was that what Mark really thought, that she would run to David? She scoffed under her breath, pressing her lips together. David had left the moment things got messy. He hadn't fought for her, hadn't even stayed to see how things would unfold. The moment Mark had shown up, David had crumbled. And yet, Claire had thrown away everything for him. Her home, her marriage, Mark, and David. He was nothing but a man who wanted the fun without the consequences. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Then, with a deep breath, she locked her phone and shoved it back into her purse. David wasn't the answer. He never had been. What have I done? Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward her car, her pace slower than usual. The energy that had once fueled her deception, the thrill of sneaking around, of knowing she was getting away with it, was gone. Now there was only exhaustion. She slipped into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as she stared out through the windshield. Her reflection in the rearview mirror caught her eye. The woman staring back at her didn't look like the confident, untouchable Claire she had always imagined herself to be. She looked small. Her makeup was flawless, her dress elegant, but it was meaningless now. The effort she had put into tonight had been for David, the man who had left without hesitation. Not for Mark, not for the man who had loved her unconditionally. Her vision blurred for a moment, but she forced back the tears, straightening her posture. Crying wouldn't change anything. Tears wouldn't undo what she had done. Mark had seen her for what she was. And worse, she had seen it too. The empty house. The drive home was suffocating in its silence. No music, no distraction, just the dull hum of the tires against the road and the racing of her thoughts. She pulled into the driveway, but the house looked different, colder, distant. The lights were off, the space inside eerily empty, despite being filled with furniture, memories, remnants of a life she had so carelessly gambled with. When she stepped inside, the air felt hollow. She knew Mark hadn't packed his things, not yet. But his presence was gone. His absence was a force of its own, heavy and suffocating. She walked through the living room, fingers brushing against the couch where they had spent countless evenings together. The space where his briefcase usually sat by the door was empty. The jacket he always left draped over the chair was missing. Claire moved toward the kitchen, hoping... For what? That he had left a note? That he had changed his mind? But there was nothing, only silence. And then she saw it, his wedding ring. It sat on the counter next to her untouched glass of wine. A final, undeniable message. Claire reached for it with shaking fingers, but the moment her skin touched the cool metal, a sob tore through her throat. She pressed the ring into her palm, gripping it tightly, as if holding on to it could somehow bring him back. But deep down she knew Mark wasn't coming back, not tonight, maybe not ever.